Timing in the Bible. How can we find... We want to talk years now. Let's talk... Everybody knows BC. BC, AD versus BC. Or BCE or CE or whatever they want to say these days. Okay, if we want timing in the Bible, one of the first great markers we get is in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says this. Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. We get a historical marker there. Oh, how many of you don't like math? Only 2. Maybe 3. I thought I saw another hand. There's plenty of math to be done with this, which is very helpful. I should have put mathematicians up there as well. Plenty of math that can be done. But the issue is the construction of the temple, the first temple, began in the 4th year of King Solomon. Okay? Remember, David had planned it out, and God said, no, you're not going to build it, but your son will build it. So we just read, as it says here, in the Masoretic Text that you're all looking at, likely, that it was 480 years after the Exodus. In Eusebius' day, the Judean script that he was looking at, which became the basis of the Masoretic, and the Samaritan, the ancient characters and the Aramaic characters version were in agreement with the 480 years. The Septuagint has it at 440. And in Eusebius' day, the Samaritan was older, and it was hard for them to say which was older, the Septuagint or the Samaritan. And again, I'm not saying this is a Samaritan Pentateuch, so please don't get them confused. We're talking about something Eusebius was looking at in his day. So,
isn't there some differences because of calendars and stuff?
That's a good point. We are going to have definitely have some calendar issues, but we do have a 40-year swing here, which is frustrating. Okay? Yes?
The beginning of the Exodus from when they actually left Egypt, or is that when they entered the Promised Land 40 years later?
So it's, well, we're going to see here in a second. The date we're talking about for this, for Solomon, breaking ground on the first temple, is 966 BC. And you're either going to add 440, because BC numbers, the higher the number, the further back, right? So you're going to take your 440 and your 480, and you're going to add those to the 966 and get you to the Exodus itself. The Bible is giving us a historical marker. Now, the Septuagint said one thing, and these two said something else, and Eusebius was trying to bridge the gap between the two, but for this, he actually went with the Judean and the Samaritan, yeah.
Well, like I say, the Exodus lasted 40 years, so is it from a marker standpoint, is it the beginning when they actually left Egypt on Passover night, or is it when they actually crossed?
This is when they left Egypt. When they left. So this is a specific date and not a range. But the difference, you bring up an interesting point, the difference may be something along those lines, but we have numbers. Numbers that the Bible provides all along the way to get us to see which one makes sense. And honestly, the 480 makes more sense than the 440, because we get numbers all throughout the book of Judges, and numbers in Deuteronomy, and numbers in Numbers. And numbers in Exodus, so to help us get to this actual number. So the historians' consensus is that it was 966 BC that the first temple began to be built, which would be the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So we start with 966, and you're going to add 480, you're going to add 440. Now, the interesting thing about the date of 966, you can get to that date of 966 by even starting closer to our time and talking about the Babylonian captivity. The closer we are to the AD, the period of AD, the more certain we are of times. And so it's great to start at some place where you're more certain, use the data that's been given you, use math, use math then to back into a date. Isn't that what that guy did in A Beautiful Mind? He used math to back into a date. Thank you.
The dating of this the,
The date, this date depend on the Exodus?
yeah,
No, the Exodus is dependent on this date. 966. Yeah. Other way around.
yeah, the other way around.
Yep. But the Exodus isn't just dependent on 1 Kings 6:1, since there is other math that we can look at. All right, so this is the simple calculation. And then I'm going to go with 1446, but in all honesty, it's kind of a circa thing, right? Many ancient dates could be circa dates plus or minus X number of years, because there are differences of calendars. There's differences of what that nation's calendar was, and this nation's calendar, and that nation's calendar. And are the two events that they're talking about, and they're separated by space, are they talking about the same time? If they're talking about the same event, then it might be the same time. And if it is the same time, then we can put them in that kind of chronological order, right? And then also the difference between solar and lunar calendars. And in tertiary months, did they actually add a month in to make up for it? The lunar year is 360 days, which is not a big deal when you're talking about a couple of years, but when you're talking about 1,000 years or so, it starts to become more significant, the difference between the two. So, and there's lack of source agreement. So I'm going to go with 1446. That's what most scholars will go with. But for me, I'm okay if there's wiggle room. X number of years, whatever X is. Probably X isn't going to be 100 years difference, but it could be tens of years different. Okay, especially since we do have this 40-year gap. So 1446 is the baseline for the Exodus. All right, Moses' birth. We don't have to look up all of these, but it says in Exodus 7:7, Moses was 80 years old when he and his brother Aaron went to talk to Pharaoh. And the Exodus itself, let my people go, that's only a couple months.
But
Okay.
the movie portrayed Moses as a young whippersnapper.
Well, 80 back then, No GMOs back then, so he looked great. I'm telling you. Yeah, more oxygen. Yeah, not as much humidity over there either. So.
He was on the shepherd's diet.
Nice.
Not bad.
You got some.
Oh man. Okay. Let's put a pen in that. Sheep's pen. All right. So Moses was born. If the Exodus is in the year 1446, circa 1446 plus 80 equals 1526 BC for Moses' birth. And since we're dealing with a range that is going around Moses' lifetime, Moses is going to die at 120. Okay, so we're talking about somewhere in the 1500s and somewhere in the 1400s. I don't want to talk about, no, it has to be this date, because there's wiggle room. All right, because of the issues around it. But, for the sake of let's look at a number, I'm going to use definite numbers. But there's wiggle room, maybe 20, 30, 40 years and all that. So if it's in this range, for later on, if the circumstances are in this range, then it's going to start to look pretty good. But we do want to see that the circumstances in Egypt at this point in Egyptian history matches what we see in the Bible, and matches what the further information that we get from Josephus, which Josephus is claiming he's getting from the Hebrew sources, Israelite sources, okay, and also pagan sources. Josephus was quoting from pagan authors as well as Israelite authors. So, but all of this needs to be taken in context, which there's a big nuance. Hollywood has done a disservice, and I'm going to plant this seed now. Egypt is just, the buildings have fallen apart. There's fires raging everywhere in Egypt. Firstborn are dead. And that's Israel leaving Egypt. That's what it looks like in Egypt, in Hollywood. Is that what the Bible says? TBD. All right, so context is important. Now, with Egyptian chronology, so that's the biblical chronology, okay? We have some solid things that we can point to get us to these dates, okay? The timing of Egyptian chronology is not so easy. Oh man, it's frustrating. I keep thinking I'm going to be reading a silver bullet somewhere that somebody overlooked. Like that's going to, and it's going to say it's actually this date. But there's no silver bullet. With Egyptian chronology, the archaeologists, the Egyptologists buy into two different chronologies. And within those chronologies, it's really an umbrella term. There's wiggle room. But the conventional chronology is the one that prevails in society today, and among Egyptologists, it's what they've accepted, and they go for it. The problem is they're not so good. When there's not a lot of info on certain pharaohs, they talk too much. They should be more like Gardner. We got rags and tatters. Let's not go crazy here. Let's have some flexibility. So they're very dogmatic and inflexible about viable. Yeah, I have no problem when they're not inflexible about things that are just stupid. Okay, but when it's a viable option, you should maybe consider it, because nobody's perfect. So that's the conventional chronology. New chronology are those who say, wait a minute, we don't have a lot of definite information. We need to look at some other sources and try to figure this out, and we may need to make some adjustments. Okay, their problem is that they're overly committed to plugging events in the Bible into pharaohs that we just don't have a lot of info on. Do you think that's a problem? We don't know much about that pharaoh, but we're going to say it's him because we don't know much about that pharaoh. And I'm not talking about Christians and Jews doing that. I'm talking about agnostics doing that. Agnostics who say, no, I don't have a dog in the religious race, but I believe what the Bible says. I don't think the Israelites were stupid and made up their own history. There's too much evidence to say the otherwise. So I think David Roll might be in danger of this, because he's put the Pharaoh of the Exodus as somebody who has a similar name, but we don't know much about him at all. So who's right? Somebody Google it. Is there a bracelet? What would Wikipedia do? Okay, here's some other things to consider. Important markers in the Bible. We also get from Abraham in Canaan until the law at Mount Sinai. So Abraham is called to Canaan when he's 75 years old. Okay? And then Moses is at Mount Sinai getting the law when he's 80 years old. Okay? And Paul says that time period is 430 years. He says it in Galatians 3:17. This was a real stumbling block for me, because I thought it was a lot longer than that. Because Abraham was supposed to have born in 2166 BC, which gave 400, so that there could be 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Josephus also says that it's 430 years from Abraham in Canaan at age 75 to Moses and Mount Sinai at age 80. Okay. Genesis 15:13 through 16, God is telling Abraham that his descendants are going to be sojourners. They're going to be enslaved. They're going to be afflicted, and they're going to be humbled for 400 years. But then in the place where they're enslaved, they're going to come out with many possessions in the fourth generation out of Egypt. Boy, people have struggled with that. Because some people say if Abraham was born like 600 years before, where do you start the count for the fourth generation? Because not only do we want to look at the Exodus, we want to look a little further back to make sure that the Bible's making sense in the other dates that it talks about. But what we get is Abraham is the father of Isaac, and this happens in Canaan. Isaac's the father of Jacob. Jacob's the father of Levi. This all happens in Canaan. So they're in Canaan, and then they go to Egypt. Remember the famine in Egypt? When they went to the famine in Egypt, Levi has his son Kohath. One. Kohath has Amram. Amram has Moses and Aaron and Miriam. And Aaron has Eleazar. And Eleazar is the leader of the Levites that are coming out. Okay, so we at least through the Levites, we see there's these 4 generations that I haven't read. So in the 4th generation out of the land of slavery, we have the 4th generation of Eleazar. In fact, we have even more information, and Numbers verifies that in Numbers chapter 3, verse 32. We have the same thing with the tribe of Judah, because this all happens in Canaan, and then Perez, Hezron, Amminadab, and Nahshon are the 4 generations that are going into Egypt and living through everything that happens in Egypt. And we get that out of Numbers 1:7, is that Nahshon who is also given in the same order from Abraham to Nahshon in Matthew chapter 1, verse 24. Nahshon is the fourth generation out of Egypt, and he's the leader of the tribe of Judah. So in the fourth generation, like it says in Genesis 15, it happens. So, but Abraham doesn't start the count for the generations. It's the generation, it's not the ones that are migrating. It's the, like my wife's parents migrated from India. But Marianne's the first generation here in America. So Levi and Judah migrated to Egypt. But the first generation in Egypt is Perez and Kohath. Okay. All right. Exodus 12:40. Sorry. I'm gonna bring all this together later. This helps us understand further back before the Exodus. Okay, it doesn't necessarily help us with the Exodus, but it helps in a certain way. It does, and I'll show you here in a moment. It at least gives us information about before that. Okay, Exodus 12:40, the Masoretic text that we all see, and also in Eusebius' day, the Judean Hebrew text that he had. It says, "Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years." Okay. But the Septuagint and the Samaritan have this to say, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years." This ties to what Paul said. Okay, it also ties to the math. We're going to see, Josephus also says the exact same thing that the Septuagint and the Samaritan Hebrew text said, is that it was 430 years in Canaan plus Egypt. Okay? So 430 years to the day. And Josephus says that they spent 215 years in Egypt. And not 400 years of slavery, but it's a combination of the time in Egypt and Canaan. But the math of all of them, whether you're going to read the Masoretic text or the Septuagint, or you're going to read the Samaritan, if you could get a hold of whatever Eusebius was looking at, the math counts the same. It's from 215 years from Abraham's 75th year, using the Masoretic numbers, using any of these numbers, because they're all the same. It's to Jacob's 130th year. Jacob was 130 when he went to Egypt. So that starts the time in Egypt. So that was 215 years. And in Egypt, it's 215 years from Jacob's 130th year to Moses' 80th year when they leave. I really feel like this is making sense. The engineer gets it in the back, yes.
So what are you basically doing? You're just going through the Bible and cross-referencing that the number is the same?
Yes, regardless. So, and it ties with what Paul said, because Paul said, hey, the promise that was given to Abraham, 430 years, the law was given to Moses at Sinai. That's what all of these are saying. So I think there's a textual issue here between these two, where this is the older, and so that it's a combination of the two. That's where I'm at. You know, I'm at that kind of like this. Maybe I got a pinky on it. Okay, so there were 400 years of being sojourners. This is interesting. They were sojourners, they were enslaved, they were afflicted, and they were humbled. And the fourth generation that was in the land of slavery that came out are the ones that exited. It is fascinating. Just look up the word sojourner and see how many times that the patriarchs use it. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. All of them are saying that. All the way down to Moses is saying it. We're sojourners. Abraham calls himself a sojourner in the land of Canaan. Jacob says, my whole life I have been a sojourner wherever I go, and I have been afflicted. When Pharaoh's talking to him, says, oh, wow, you're an old guy, and I love your son, and you know, what's going on? My life sucks. I've been a sojourner all these years, and it sucks. It's long, and I'm not going to live as long as my forebears, but you know. All of these references are them calling themselves sojourners. They're sojourners even in the promised land, but they don't own the promised land. The only part that was owned was what Abraham bought for a grave from the Hittite Ephron to put Sarah in. Yeah, very good. Excellent.
And what does the word sojourner mean?
Sojourner is when you don't. We're all sojourners, by the way. Our citizenship is in heaven. So this is not our home. Okay?
We're aliens.
We're aliens. So fortunately, everyone's going to Area 51, but we're the aliens. They're not going to own the land until they get there. It's not their land until they get there. The ownership, like David isn't king until he's coronated. Okay? He's anointed king, but he doesn't have kingship until he actually gets it, right? They don't get the land. It's not really their land until they actually come back into the land. In fact, God said in Genesis 15, that same section where he was saying they're going to be enslaved and sojourners and all that, he said they're not going to come back to this land because God is saying that the inhabitants of the land, their sin has not reached its full measure yet. So God's having mercy on the Canaanites. And there's a lot of, you read Genesis, there's a lot of good Canaanites. And some bad ones. But in Abraham's day, it would have been weird to say, they have become so wicked that they should be wiped out, some of them. That wouldn't make a lot of sense, but it makes a lot of sense 400 years later. Okay, so here's how it kind of, this is the breakdown between time in Canaan versus time in Egypt with respect to how many years they were there. So when Abraham's in Canaan at the age of 75, that's the first year. Isaac is born 25 years later when he's 100. Jacob's born 85 years later. Abraham dies 100 years after coming to Canaan. Levi's born 171 years after Abraham came to Canaan when he was 75. Isaac dies 205 years after Abraham came to Canaan. And Jacob left for Egypt 215 years. This is the math that the Bible provides. I didn't believe it. I said, that's stupid. The first time, David Roll's the one that said it. And so first of all, I was skeptical because he was saying he's an agnostic. And I thought, well, why is he saying that? And he said, he was very patient with me. And I wasn't rude to him. I mean, don't be rude to people, right? And he said, you need to go do the math in the Bible and go check out Josephus. And I said, come on, man, 430, 215 plus 215 is 430. Why does it have to be perfect like that? Well, that's just the way it worked out. You know what that means? How many of you numerologists are out there? Yeah, me neither. It doesn't mean anything. So, with Jacob in Egypt is the first year when he's 130, all the way down to the Exodus. And all of the math is here. I got all of these numbers from the Bible. And so these are the years that they were there, 215, 215. With that, we couple the 1446 BC. You can add all these numbers and come up with the good BC dates. So Abraham was in Canaan around 1876. BC, thank you. Yeah. Circa. What if it's 1901? I don't care. Fine, it's 1901. What if it's 1850? I don't care. It is what it is. The Bible has given me these dates. I'm trying to match them with our dating system, with all the different calendar situations, the lunar calendar versus solar calendar.
Sounds like you need to try harder.
Yeah. So wrapping it up here, the key points. Moses was born around 1526 BC. The Bible's providing this, all that to get to this timing. Okay? All of that was just to get to this timing. The Exodus was around circa 1446. Abraham in Canaan to Sinai was 1876. Abraham in Canaan until Moses is at Sinai was this range of BC dates, 1876 to 1446. There was 430 years in Canaan and Egypt, so 215 in Canaan and 215 in Egypt. Oh, one thing I needed to point out here. Slaves in Egypt. We're going to find that the slavery in Egypt didn't begin until after the generation of Levi and Joseph, the sons of Jacob, died. It was after that. So slavery began somewhere around, I don't have a good number on this. This is not, the Bible didn't provide this other than the circumstance. Somewhere around 100 years after they got into Egypt. 100 years after Jacob was 130. Okay? So the slavery in Egypt only lasted about 115 years. But the sojourning and the being humbled and always having trouble and strife this whole time, that was always going on all 430 years. Okay, so that's the key points. establishing this time, okay, it's going to help us to proceed with the circumstances. We'll look at the circumstances of what's going on in Exodus. What information does Josephus give us? That's going to help us, provide us with a template of what we should be. If it's like this in these dates and in these circumstances in Egypt, then we probably have a pretty good match. But the circumstances in Egypt have to match in context.